let's talk about trees. So on the trees, there are a couple of very basic things which I'm sure everybody knows, but the term deciduous and coniferous. The deciduous trees, an example would be like an oak tree, something like that. Coniferous trees would be like something like a pine tree, sort of hardwood versus softwood. Amusingly, of course, as everybody's probably heard before, there are plenty of softwoods that are actually harder than some hardwoods, and there are some hardwoods that are softer than other, like it's don't get overly specific about what those terms mean. But these two categories will sort of divide the way that you respond to a lot of the different questions that come up that have to do with landscaping. So, for example, if we're going to have on either the multiple choice or on the vignette, anything that's talking about view control. So let's say we have a loading dock and we don't want the restaurant patrons to be looking at the loading dock, and we're going to do something about landscaping. Well, clearly I'm not going to use a deciduous tree that has this sort of large full canopy, but I can see straight through if I'm standing over in the restaurant. I would use for view control, this is probably the worst coniferous drawing ever done, but you get the idea. I would use this sort of pine tree type of coniferous tree, because that same view is going to get blocked down where the views are important. Is it true that all deciduous trees are going to have a big clear space before the canopy starts? No, that's not always true, but it is true in terms of the exam. It's how we talk about it on the exam. Is it always true that all coniferous trees will be solid way down close to the grade? No, it's not true. Is it true on the exam? Yes, it's true on the exam. So this is how we talk about trees on the exam in order to give a sort of clarity to the difference of what the point of using these landscaping elements is. So a similar way of thinking about it, sort of view is one example, but another example would be sort of wind control. The deciduous tree will actually impact wind. It'll slow and create turbulence and create different pressures, a bunch of those ideas, but it won't do it when you really want it. When the winter is at hand and the leaves have all dropped off, the branches will make a difference in terms of how the wind is going, but it's not going to have that solid feeling that the coniferous trees will. So when it comes to wind, anytime anybody mentions wind, you're talking about a coniferous tree. You have two choices usually on the vignettes, and you should definitely choose correctly. If it's about view control, if it's about wind, it's the coniferous trees. If it's about providing shade, then it's the deciduous tree. So think about shade. The coniferous tree, I have that sun angle coming from way up there. That coniferous tree isn't really giving us much shade, but this one, I'm getting a big area where people can be. Picnic tables could be, your building could be. There's lots of different ways that this deciduous tree can be very helpful from a shade standpoint. So you're talking about wind, you're talking about view control, then you're talking about coniferous trees. When you're talking about shade, you're talking about deciduous trees. The computer will see you as doing it wrong if you try using a coniferous tree for shade. So it's just one of those ways that it gets simplified out in this particular world. Now, one of the reasons I say that gets simplified is, well, let's say you're comparing a 35-foot tall, maple tree or something, and I'm comparing that to a 70-foot tall pine tree. Well, clearly that 70-foot tall pine tree is going to cast a pretty long shadow. So these things actually are much, much more complicated out in real life. But for the exam, they're going to be simplified. So keep it in mind that they're simplified and use that to your advantage. couple of other terms that come to mind you should be comfortable with. One is the idea of the drip line. So in a drip line, the concept here is that if I have this tree and it has this big canopy and the canopy reaches out a certain distance, the assumption is that the root ball is also reaching out to effectively the same distance. So as the water would drip off that edge of the canopy, that in sort of presumably a sort of circular plan on the site plan is going to be the area that you don't want to disturb, because I don't want to mess, I wouldn't want to dig into this ground to put in, say, a foundation or something, and therefore damage that, that root ball and therefore kill the tree. So by thinking of this line as the important line, this very far outside most point, what that's saying is no buildings, no roadways, nothing goes into that distance. Now, if you're on the vignette and it's very close and you just clip a little bit, I don't think you're going to fail because of that, but that's something that you really want to try to not have happen. You want to try to keep roads, buildings, and things away from the drip line, because the drip line is the root line. There's also a couple of important concepts that will show up, the idea of formal relationships versus informal relationships. We'll talk about it in a couple of spots here, but I think this is fairly self-explanatory, but it is important to say when you read something like formal or informal on the exam, take it very seriously. It is not a sense that they're going to say, they're not going to be loose about a term like that. If something says formal, that means the trees line up. If it says informal, that means there's no pattern. It's not going to be halfway in between. It's not going to be some of the trees line up. Again, for simplicity's sake, they go out of their way to make these things clear, which is actually kind of funny because, of course, they're not clear at all because they never explain themselves. But the idea is that they make these things very clear. So if it says formal, that means all your trees line up. If it says informal, that means there's some other grouping that is not decipherable to a geometry.